Okay, hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And it's my great pleasure to host this meeting. Just a few quick words on why we're doing this. This is a particular program that emerged out of the pandemic when it was not possible to do anything but virtual presentations. And we saw an opportunity for individuals around the world, and especially those at early career stages, to share their research in this format. And so we've been doing it since the fall of 2020, showcasing virtual research presentations from international scholars with commentaries from local MCBS community members. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today, Eden Smith from the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies and the MetaMelb Research Institute at the University of Melbourne in Australia, up bright and early on Thursday morning for us, to talk about exploring goal-directed uses of the replicability concept. Eden, the floor is yours.
Apologies, I lose my screen when I share my slides, so I had to come back. Good afternoon, morning. Thank you for having me. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Okay. As mentioned, I'm joining you from Melbourne, or Naarm, in Australia, where I am privileged to live on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I just want to start by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of First Nations people across the world in building better futures, given this is an international forum. Okay, so today, before I start, actually, I want to note that this, what I'm presenting today is based on a 2021 preprint that I co-authored with colleagues from the interdisciplinary MetaMelb Research Institute, namely Hannah Fraser, Stephen Camburis, Fallon Modi, Martin Bush, and Fiona Fiddler. I have written a talk, so all errors are my own, but just to keep that in mind. And some additional context is that this paper builds on some of my earlier publications where I drew together several strands of literature to compare how specific scientific concepts have been used as goal-directed tools within experiments. And I'm going to touch on this foundation later, but I want to be upfront that I don't intend to justify this view of concepts today. I'm going to briefly outline it and then take that as a foundation. What I want to do instead is use that kind of view as a starting point to explore a potential extension of that. And that extension is this proposal that there is value in reflexively interrogating the concepts we use for studying the situated dynamics of investigative practices in a similar way to how we might benefit from how we justify which tools we use within experiments. And to illustrate this potential, I'm going to draw on this view of concepts as goal-directed tools to compare the variable uses of the replicability concept for studying the dynamics of establishing the credibility of research claims. For this purpose, the replicability concept can be understood very broadly to refer to a range of different practices, variously termed, of repeating a prior study more or less closely. And today I'm going to focus on uses of this replicability concept for studying the role of some of these practices in helping to establish the credibility of research claims within various sciences. From a view of concepts as tools, when being used for studying experimental practices, additional characteristics are thought to be required to individuate a type of phenomena of interest, or in this case, a practice of interest to study. So I'm going to return to these characteristics in a bit more detail, but when I do, it's important to keep in mind that I'm not attempting to resolve the disputed definitions of replication or any associated terms. What I'm interested in doing is describing how variable uses of this replicability concept might be of interest in relation to each other. And to do that, I'm going to highlight a couple of converging or complementary insights about the dynamics of scientific practices that these two approaches to studying replication practices might be offering us, even while the referential term continues to be disputed. So to that end, I want to compare two uses of the replicability concept within studies that focus on either evaluating specific scientific practices or analysing the dynamics of scientific practices within broader contexts. And while these two approaches often overlap, articulating the couple of differences is useful to highlight examples, or I think are examples of how the replicability concept is being used to pursue two different goals. So in this context, evaluative approaches are exemplified by studies that involve gathering empirical evidence typically about contemporary replication practices, where that evidence is being intended or offered to inform initiatives for improving specific aspects of how we generate and disseminate credible research claims. Meanwhile, what I'm calling analytic approaches are exemplified by studies situating the role of various replication practices within their broader context, both historically and contemporary. Insights from such analysis tend, rather than focusing directly on improving scientific practices, these are more likely to be offered as contributions to our broader understandings of the complex dynamics of generating and disseminating credible research claims, or various subsets of that. Okay, so as with concepts used within experiments, which I'll come back to, these uses of the replicability concept rely on sets of characteristics that individuate the specific type or form of replication practices that's relevant to a context-specific goal. So I'm going to begin by noting the range of practices associated with the concept of replicability, variously termed. And with that context in mind, I'm then going to briefly outline that strand of scholarship I mentioned that I'm drawing on for my view of concepts as goal-directed tools when used within investigative practice. And then I'm going to build on that to present that extension proposal that this view of concepts can be can provide some insight into how we might reflexively interrogate the concepts we use when studying scientific practices in turn as philosophers, historians, sociologists, and so forth. Okay. Okay, so as many of you will be aware, there are numerous typologies describing how replications differ from related practices. To illustrate this, I've outlined just a few of the many terms associated with the concept of replicability on this side. Some more detailed examples I'll just offer just to provide a bit more context. So in the 1990s, both Nancy Cartwright and Hans Raeder independently positioned replication of experimental results in the middle of different three-level typologies of the practices they viewed as crucial for assessing a research claim. For Nancy Cartwright, the other two levels were routine checking of the implementation of a given study and the reproduction of the phenomenon. Where for Hans Raeder, the other two levels were the exact repeatability of the experiment from the same point of view of the theoretical interpretation of the question, and secondly, the reproducibility of the material realization of the experiment regardless of the theoretical expectation. As a different example, more recently, in 2019, Matthew McDermott and colleagues offered a different three criteria, and this time, replication was in third position with the focus on replicating results under conceptually identical conditions. While the other two criteria involve the reproduction of results under identical technical conditions and the reproduction of results under statistically identical conditions. Now, There are many other ways of differentiating forms of replications from related practices. And as I'll touch on in a moment, most of these vary on the degree of emphasis given to the importance of a specific aspect of experimental or investigative practices. So it might be the reliability of the reported effect, the robustness of the phenomena of interest, and so on. So alongside these efforts at differentiating replications from related practices, there have also been attempts to characterize specific types of replication practices. For example, a survey of the social science literature by Omar Gomez and colleagues in 2010 identified 79 replication types described across 18 replication typologies. More recently, when Hannah Fraser and colleagues asked ecologists in 2020 about replications, they presented 6 variations on how a study might be repeated, and they asked which of these the ecologists considered to be replications. Less than 40% chose only one option. So most of them have these like multiple associations with this concept. And as with the previous slide, my point here is to highlight that there is no single term that refers to all the specific practices characterized as contributing to the replicability of a research claim. And however, disagreements over defining the term replication are only part of the story, in my opinion. In addition to the terminological ambiguities, the range of overlapping characteristics draws attention to the variable roles that replication practices are expected to play in establishing the credibility of a research claim. So, for instance, there are many ways of cutting this again, but there are at least 3 different epistemic outcomes that I've seen associated with repeating a given study. On the one hand, you might repeat a study to test for the stability of a research finding, and doing this is thought to contribute to establishing the reliability of a finding in a controlled condition, because you need to be able to repeat it. There is also the role of interrogating the persistence of an effect across multiple techniques and study designs, and this form of triangulation can contribute to confidence in the robustness of the phenomenon of interest. Meanwhile, testing for robust findings across varied contexts can also contribute to our confidence in the generalizability of the research claims, and this is especially useful when we've also got some reliable and robust findings to build upon. While there's no single type of replication that provides a test for reliability, robustness, and generalizability, as I'm using those terms, it is possible that different replication types might contribute or might help establish an aspect of the credibility of research claims. So these challenges in how we characterize replication practices and the wide range of practices in that is well recognized, and I don't really want to go down that track. There's a bunch of different approaches to this question. I'm just going to name 2 to kind of point you in different directions. This one hopefully is familiar. So even when a given set of practices is agreed to count as a replication within a given context, say in a controlled environment, there are further difficulties in determining what counts as a successful replication. I'll touch on this a bit, but there's a bunch of research out here on that. For example, as many of you may know, Samuel Fletcher has drawn attention to the lack of justifications provided for the various ways in which the success or failure of a replication are measured. And that notion of measuring adds another layer of difficulty on what I'm going to be talking about. Meanwhile, Nicole Nelson and colleagues have suggested that disagreements about replications reflect foundational differences in perspectives, from entrained disciplinary differences to differences in baseline assumptions about the intrinsic heterogeneity or lack thereof within the natural world. I'm going to take a focus on a kind of niche aspect approach here, and instead I want to explore the possibility that viewing replicability as a goal-directed tool for studying scientific practices might highlight the way in which this concept can function productively, even when the relevant terms or defining characteristics are ambiguous. So I'm using this as a case study of a broader kind of notion rather than focusing on the concept, or focusing on disagreements about replication per se. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, I'm drawing on this field of scholarship that offers a view of concepts as being structured within communities of practice. And this view reflects a strand of history and historical and philosophical approaches to studying the role of concepts within a range of investigative practices, from experiments to field studies. When I was looking at this, primarily I was focusing on experiments, so I'll often use that, but it is typically thought of in broader terms. So to summarize this view, I'm treating scientific concepts as accrued bodies of shared knowledge that are used by communities of practice as tools that function to investigate a specific phenomena for specific goals within a given knowledge claim. And there's a lot to unpack in that sentence. And while the extent of this literature goes beyond today's scope, I just want to draw attention to some of the key elements I've adopted that, while might be taken for granted in some contexts, aren't in others. So, firstly, this view of concepts that I'm taking reflects an appreciation that concepts can be neither reduced to their reference nor dismissed as mere social constructs. Vaso-Kindi and others have demonstrated this in various ways. My view also reflects, in turn, an appreciation that having emerged and evolved within locally contingent and historically dynamic patchworks of small communities of practice, concepts can resist their intended use when contributing to empirical knowledge production. So this notion that we don't necessarily have full control over the set of associations you might have, and so forth. I'll come back to that. These contributions to the contributions of concepts to experimental practice are therefore can be understood to extend beyond the traditionally recognised role of concepts as mental and linguistic representations, without being so pervasive that they become conceptual elements of broader systems such as esteem. So it's kind of like a middle ground. Within this context, Uliana Feast and Corinne Block-Mullins, among others, have argued that concepts can function as tools to individuate instances of a phenomenon of interest for further investigation, with individuation from potentially related phenomena based on the distinguishing characteristics available for that phenomenon within the relevant body of knowledge at the time. Okay, so when used as tools, I'm taking concepts as being able to function productively within investigative practices without needing to refer to a universally accepted referent or even a referent accepted within across different fields. So Frederick Steinel has argued that concepts don't function as true or false statements, and instead that they need to be judged as appropriate or not in relation to their use for a given goal. And contributing to this strand of thought, Ingo Brigant has offered a description of 3 of the distinct yet interdependent roles that concepts can play within investigative practice, or the components of concepts. And I'm going to draw on this, so I'll just outline them briefly. So firstly, we have the referential component, and that is the kinds of entities, properties, or processes or practices that a concept is intended to refer to. Secondly, there's the inferential component. This is all the connecting beliefs about how a concept can be used to support the inferences and explanations between that concept and other concepts within a given language community. And thirdly, we have the epistemic goal. And this component, it is through this, emerges through the standards that are set for what a concept can be used for within a community of practice. In early research, I synthesized these insights along with others to explore how scientific concepts can function as tools that are structured within communities of practice for pursuing context-specific goals within individual neuroimaging experiments. And I'm going to jump a huge jump to explore now kind of, rather than focus on different kinds of experiments, I'm looking at exploring how studies into the uses of concepts within investigative practices, such as the one I just mentioned, can be extended to interrogate how we use concepts in turn for studying investigative practices. Okay. So in this extension, I want to focus on the notion that a concept can be used to pursue context-specific goals even when the referent is disputed. To illustrate this notion, I compare the use of the replicability concept for either evaluating or analysing replication practices. And the extension here is the notion that if disputed concepts can function as productive tools within an experiment, it is possible that there are productive ways to use contested concepts when studying the dynamics and outcomes of investigative practices. I mean, we do this anyway, so I'm kind of hoping that that is the case, but I want to explore it in more detail. Additionally, just as concepts can be appropriate or not for pursuing specific goals within an experiment, uses of a given concept for studying scientific practices might also be assessed in terms of appropriateness for specific goals rather than focusing on whether or not we can align on a single definition. So connected to this notion is that when used as tools for, when used as tools within an experiment, concepts single out instances of the type of phenomena of interest based on a set of distinguishing characteristics available within the available body of knowledge, as I mentioned. And to extend this point from concepts used within investigative practices to those concepts used to study scientific practices, I'm going to treat the practices being studied as analogous to the phenomena of interest within an experiment. With this view, concepts such as replicability can be understood as tools for singling out instances of a particular type of practice for further evaluation and or analysis within the available body of knowledge provided by the relevant discursive context. And as with individuating an instance of a given phenomenon for further study in an experiment, the process of individuating a specific replication practice for further evaluative or analytic study seems to involve articulating the distinguishing characteristics that help to single out instances of that practice within a broader typology of related practices and instances that are relevant to a particular to the goal of either evaluating or analysing the field of study. So this brings us to the characteristics, which I've gone on about a bit already. And these characteristics for individuating a given conceptualization of a phenomena or practice of interest, these characteristics can simultaneously describe specific referential targets and also reflect the inferential associations and structural practices entrenched in the contextual goals of the concept as used within the relevant context. So thinking about this in terms of how the replicability concept is used highlights the interdependence of multiple components. So this includes an explicit or implied referential target, such as the specific set of practices taken to count as repeating a prior study more or less closely. And in some contexts, you need to repeat more closely than in other contexts, depending on what you're trying to get at. There are also a range of inferential associations. That is, the expectations about how this specific way of repeating a study that's been referred to might establish the intended credibility criterion, for example, whether that criteria is reliability, robustness, generalizability, or something else. Then there is the epistemic goal that sets the standards within which the practices of interest are studied. In this context, that's the difference between aiming to improve or understand the role of replication practices within the science. And while these are inextricably linked, today I want to focus on the third component to explore the potential value of paying attention to the goal we have for using a given concept when studying a given set of scientific practices. Okay, so that was pretty brief, but each of those points was intended to illustrate how insights gained from examining the variable uses of scientific concepts in experiments as goal-directed tools might offer an avenue for reflecting on how disputed concepts are used to study scientific practices. To illustrate these possibilities more concretely, I'm focus on interrogating the replicability concept as if it is used as a goal-directed tool for studying scientific practices. In doing so, I hope to demonstrate that there is value in identifying potential goal-directed uses of the concepts we use when studying scientific practices. So the two, I'm going to focus on two approaches, but there are many approaches to studying how replication practices contribute to scientific knowledge. And I'm only focusing on what I'm describing as the evaluative approach and the analytic approach. And I mentioned these overlap in practice. The difference I want to emphasize is that the evaluative approach is exemplified by studies that gather empirical evidence and use the concept of replicability to examine the practices of repeating prior research within various scientific fields. And in line with this approach, the replicability concept tends to be used with the goal of improving how specific types of replication practices can contribute to the credibility of research claims. Meanwhile, the analytic approach is exemplified by studies that draw on historical and contemporary sources, and these tend to use the concept of replicability to analyze how, why, and when repeating or not repeating prior research has contributed or not to various scientific practices. And in this approach, the replicability concept tends to be used with the goal of understanding the role of specific types of replication practices within the broader dynamics of generating and disseminating credible research claims. Okay, so diving into some of the details. I'm going to start with the evaluative approaches and give some examples, and then jump to the analytic approaches and give some examples, and then try and pull that together. So in terms of evaluative approaches, as I've described them, their focus is on studying scientific practices with the goal of improving the credibility of research claims. And many of these studies draw on social science techniques and take the value of replication, variously characterized, as a given, focusing instead on explaining the low rate of scientific research claims being repeated and proposing strategies for increasing this rate within specific sciences. These types of studies have highlighted the low proportion of studies that attempt to replicate previous findings across many different fields, including psychology, ecology, biology, the biomedical sciences, and so on. They also explore when and why scientists seek out replication studies and propose different approaches to reconciling the results of original and repeated study, what counts as successful replication, and so forth. Along the way, it has become clear that, while traditionally assumed to be routine in principle, the actual practice of repeating prior research findings are infrequently attempted and more complicated to conduct than often assumed. One evaluative response to this realization has been to examine the barriers to attempting replication, such as the institutionalized structures that disincentivize repeating prior research. This includes the pressure to publish large volumes of research with novel results, as well as the acceptability of poorly reported methods, which incidentally together make it more logistically difficult to repeat a study and more difficult to publish it. Additionally, given the small number of replications being attempted and the low rate of successful replications within that, studies evaluating the role of replications have also explored perceptions of replication practices among scientists. For example, in the survey of ecologists mentioned earlier, an overwhelming majority of ecologists expressed support for replication studies, yet few checked for replication studies when assessing others' research claims themselves. So ambiguity over replication responsibilities aside, evaluative approaches to studying scientific practices tend to reflect expectations that research findings can and should be repeatable. For example, reflecting this expectation, many initiatives aim to reduce the barriers to repeating prior research. For example, Daniel Hamilton and colleagues suggest that registered reports and results blind peer reviews could ensure that findings from repeated studies are publishable by avoiding that novel result expectation during the peer review process. Meanwhile, Rose O'Day and colleagues propose incentivizing standardized reporting practices to better support expectations that research findings be repeatable, including by sharing data collection decisions, describing key assumptions, and specifying the unit of replication. Now, while initiatives for reducing barriers to repeating research findings have dominated, it's important to note that insights from evaluative approaches do sometimes converge with the analytic approaches I'm about to talk about. An example of this is Tal Iaccone's argument that while efforts to establish that an effect is repeatably precise are important, it only matters if the research claim is meaningful at a scale that is generalizable beyond the constraints of one initial study. Relatedly, Peter Isagar and colleagues suggest that decisions about what to replicate should also consider the degree of uncertainty about the reliability of the research findings, the epistemic value attributed to how a research claim is replicated, and the utility and risks that an unreplicated finding presents if the associated claims are disseminated to contexts with high impact consequences, such as building a bridge or health policy, and so forth. Reflecting these contextual considerations, some evaluative approaches suggest an even broader range of improvements to scientific practices, such as promoting intellectual humility when repeating both original and repeated findings. So while a very small snippet of examples from this area, what I want to highlight is that evaluative approaches to studying scientific practices using the replicability concept in ways that help draw attention to the importance of appreciating the resource constraints that researchers operate within and the broader conditions within research claims. And that is one of the broader conditions within which research claims are generated and disseminated as well. So shifting now to the analytic what I'm calling the analytic approach. Again, these overlap with the evaluative approaches, yet they tend to start from a different perspective. Drawing on historical, philosophical, and social studies of sciences, these approaches often include descriptive accounts of the diachronic conditions within which bodies of scientific knowledge emerge. Therefore, rather than directly contributing to improvement initiatives, analytic accounts tend to contribute to our understanding of the dynamic practices involved in generating and disseminating scientific knowledge within the context of a discourse, a historical discussion or philosophical context, and so forth. Within this context, uses of the replicability concept to analyse how, why, and when prior research is repeated have highlighted the limitations of universalising expectations of any singular form of replication. For example, Stephen Guttinger provides descriptions of routine and under-acknowledged micro-replications within contemporary life sciences and uses these to draw attention to the possibility that expecting a singular replication practice as a universal epistemic norm may obscure how prior findings are actually being repeated in practice. There are also multiple descriptions of credible investigative findings that can't feasibly be reproduced, such as those involving perishable samples or rare conditions, and those carried out in idiosyncratic environmental conditions, such as in some field studies. In one example, James Bogan describes how an unreplicated research claim came to be considered foundational to contemporary neuroscientific knowledge about the motor cortex and experiences of epileptic seizure. This claim was based on findings originally reported by John Hewling Jackson in the 19th century, based on his studies of rare neurological conditions. While not replicated, this claim was deemed credible based on a range of other factors, including the transparency and detail of his documentation, the plausibility of the associated research claims given existing knowledge at the time, and the reputation of Jackson and those who advocated on behalf of his research. Again, while efforts to position replication practices as one of many strategies for establishing credibility have dominated, some insights from analytic approaches also converge with those from evaluative approaches. So an example of this is Felipe Romero's work, which has highlighted that even in fields with high degree of control over research variables, where it's possible to repeat prior studies in a kind of routinely feasible way, replication practices still rely on institutional support, as we've heard, and as such are rarely conducted. So, oops, I'm sorry. In addition to this, analytic approaches have contributed to our understanding that In addition to those replications that help establish reliability, other forms of replications can contribute to establishing the persistence of a reported effect, the robustness of the phenomena of interest, and the generalizability of the associated claim. And in doing so, these approaches have drawn attention to a wide collection of important practices that combine to each contribute to establishing research credibility. Rather than needing to decide on any single replication practice as the gold standard, the idea is that you've got this patchwork approach. For instance, Miki Boone argues that multiple elements of scientific practices work together to establish the robustness of a scientific effect, including those that help to establish the reliability of a finding when repeating experiments, as well as practices that triangulate evidence to establish the stability of the phenomena of interest under different research conditions. We've also just seen that the credibility of research can be determined by broader considerations even when replications aren't feasible. This includes reporting practices, plausibility given existing knowledge, reputation, and a host of other factors. So in describing this range of scientific practices, analytic approaches help highlight the importance of being explicit about the context-specific expectations for a given replication and the variable context within which expectations about repeating the finding of prior research are appropriate. There we go. Sorry, switching between slides. So now with that kind of brief set of examples from each case, I want to draw together my reflections on the context-specific uses of the replicability concept just outlined with my view of concepts as goal-directed tools that I introduced earlier. In doing so, I hope to illustrate how reflecting on goal-directed uses of the replicability concept offers an avenue for exploring some of the shared challenges and convergent insights emerging from these two approaches. And one obvious shared challenge to studying replication practices is the inconsistent terminologies and ambiguous characteristics associated with the replicability concept. Drawing on the view that scientific concepts can function productively even when we don't necessarily agree about the referent, I propose that variable characterizations of the replicability concept need not undermine either evaluative or analytic studies to scientific practice, and they kind of highlight that they don't necessarily have to agree. Instead, viewing replicability as a goal-directed tool suggests that both approaches may help mitigate this challenge. For example, together these approaches draw attention to the importance of clarifying how a specific characterization of replicability is relevant to the goal of evaluating or analysing the scientific practices of interest when viewed in this particular way that I'm suggesting. Another converging insight emerging from these two approaches to studying replication practices is that, on the one hand, the focus of evaluative approaches on the constraints limiting replication attempts has helped to demonstrate that the practices required to establish the reliability of a research finding are not as routine as once hoped. Meanwhile, interest in robustness and generalizability within analytic studies have highlighted that establishing the reliability of research findings is just one aspect of a broader collection of practices that might each contribute to establishing different aspects of research credibility. This links back to my earlier suggestion that several functions are expected from repeating a study more or less closely, and that those expectations both inform and reflect the type of replication practices individuated by the goal-directed use of the replicability concept. For example, if the goal is to improve the credibility of research within a context where it is reasonable to expect results to be repeatable, then evaluating the role of replications in establishing the reliability of prior findings might be a priority. Meanwhile, if the goal is to understand the role of replications in establishing research credibility within the context of describing a diverse range of scientific practices, then there is also value in analysing examples of when replication practices help to establish the persistence of a robust effect and/or the generalizability of the associated research claims. Not to mention those contexts where one idealised type of replication isn't feasible. Okay, so I'm just being aware of time here, and I'm going to rush through this slide a little bit. So the value of the convergence can be seen within recent shifts within both approaches, and I've touched on this. But even while focusing on different aspects of the scientific practices, these two approaches can be drawn together to provide converging insights about when and why establishing replicability is relevant to demonstrating the credibility of research. For example, evaluative accounts draw attention to the range of barriers inhibiting attempts to replicate findings, logistical difficulties, poor documentation, and so on. Complementing this, analytic approaches draw attention to the importance of situating expectations of replicability within relevant epistemic communities, of recognizing that repeating findings are not always feasible, and identifying when it is more appropriate to focus on establishing the stability and persistence of a phenomenon of interest under different research conditions. So to recap, on the right side. Oh, sorry, that was that last slide. Sorry, I've jumped over a slide. I'll leave it there for a moment. So to recap, today I've drawn on literature demonstrating the uses of concepts within investigative practices to treat the replicability concept as a goal-directed tool for studying the broader dynamics of those practices. To illustrate the potential of examining the ways in which we can use concepts as goal-directed tools when studying scientific practices, I've offered a descriptive exploration of two of the potential productive uses of the replicability concept. The first of these uses was exemplified. The first of these uses was exemplified by studies that focus on evaluating the degree to which prior research is repeated within contemporary investigative practices, with the goal of informing initiatives for improving the credibility of research claims. The second of these uses was exemplified by studies that focus on analysing when, how, and why research has or hasn't been repeated across a range of historical and contemporary scientific practices, with the goal of contributing to understanding the long-term dynamics of generating and disseminating scientific knowledge. In comparing how these two uses of the replicability concept can function as a tool for pursuing these distinct goals, I've sought to illustrate the value of paying attention to the concepts we use for studying the dynamics of scientific practices in a similar way to the interest shown in interrogating the uses of concepts and other tools within experiments. In the case of replicability concept, I've suggested a little bit about the converging insights, but that's more as part of the case study, and but we can talk about either way if interested. Okay, I'll leave it there. And I just want to finish by saying I appreciate this opportunity to feedback and I hope you've enjoyed this very exploratory approach.
Thank you very much, Eden. That was great. So now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sam Fletcher, here in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota, who will be sharing his reflections with a commentary on Eden Smith's exploring goal-directed uses of the replicability concept. Sam, floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much for the stimulating presentation, Eden. What I'd like to do is kind of prime our discussion by talking about three sorts of queries or questions. So first, is the project entirely descriptive, or does it have normative components? That is to say, does it have normative components for how philosophers of science should be interacting or investigating the concept of replicability and its significance for science? Second, what's the relationship between the two uses of the replicability concept discussed? And third, and on this one, I'll have the most to say, what is credibility exactly? And is it really essential to the replicability concept? So let's start on the first query. So there's lots of aspects that are of the project that are quite clearly descriptive. For instance, one of the goals is to compare the uses of the replicability concept within two kinds of approaches to studying investigative practices. This is about describing differences without evaluating them. Another goal is to draw attention to how different goal-directed uses of the replicability concept can provide complementary insights. The idea here being that complementary just means observation of compatibility and non-redundancy without any evaluation. But sometimes there's some hints, right, that there are normative goals, if they are not foregrounded, that are kind of in the background of the project. So let's look at this particular aspect here. Concepts can be used as productive tools within investigative practices, and these italics or emphasis are from the original, even when their referential components remain disputed. I wonder, is the idea supposed to be that this is implicitly responding to some in philosophy of language or aspects of philosophy of science influenced by philosophy of language, where people insist otherwise, and this is intended to demonstrate that that insistence or that thesis is misguided? Also, from the same portion of the talk, variable uses of a given concept for studying scientific practices could similarly be assessed in terms of appropriateness for the relevant goal, and again, emphasis as in the original, rather than as a universally applicable concept. Right? Is the idea supposed to be this is contrasting with others who think that a universally applicable concept is needed, or that somehow a universally applicable concept is not as valuable or worthwhile to pursue? To illustrate this, right, we can have two kinds of conceptions of the replicability concept. I've drawn this nice illustration from Eden's presentation, where we have the original, which you might think represents a kind of plurality of different replication concepts, each of them bearing some certain resemblance to each other, but not collected together as a whole, versus a kind of universalism where one sees each of these instances, despite their localized differences, as having something in common that's worth emphasizing. So sometimes, right, in philosophy, people talk about splitters versus lumpers. The splitters would like to emphasize differences between categories and instances, whereas the lumpers see commonalities between them. Now, I think that there is something to be said for each sort of approach, but I wonder whether or not there is intended some sort of normative background towards splitting over lumping in the particular approach. So the second question has to do with how we can, what we can learn from the differences between the two uses of the replicability concept. Investigated, this is a slide from Eden's presentation. And Eden concludes that that these provide complementary insights. And so I'm curious, if they do provide complementary insights, how do they complement one another exactly? It's not merely that they are different insights, but that the two insights, when combined, add something that goes beyond each of them, what each of them adds individually. I'd like to hear more about that. So the third question has to do with credibility. Now, there's lots of discussion of credibility in Eden's talk, and I'd like to have a conversation about that in particular. So here's a few examples of some quotations. Replicability refers to some specified aspect of credibility granted to a research claim based on a type of replication practice. Variable uses of the replicability concept as goal-directed tools can provide complementary insights about the role of replication in assessing research credibility. Eden emphasized that some studies focus on evaluating scientific practices with the goal of improving the credibility of research claims, while others on understanding the very dynamics of generating and disseminating credible research claims. And we also have that the replicability concepts include expectations about how a specific way of repeating a study establishes credibility. So one way of formulating the question is, what exactly is credibility? Now, in everyday language, there's two related conceptions of credibility. One you might call the credible as the true. So for instance, a credible threat is a true threat. But if that's right, and this is the intended sense of credibility, we could ask, why would replication establish the truth of research or a research claim? Shouldn't other aspects of the research matter? There's another version of credibility, which you might think of as the credible as the believable. So for instance, a credible story is a believable story. But there's similar questions here. Why would replication research establish the believability of research or a research claim? shouldn't, for instance, our prior beliefs about the research subject matter? So let me give you an example. So in the history of psychology, there is a branch of psychologists who identify as parapsychologists. They're interested in extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and related phenomena, which they collectively call psi. And early research in parapsychology was reproducible. The experiments that various researchers conducted were repeatable and had reliable results that indicated the existence of these phenomena. But these replicable results didn't deliver credibility to the research claims. Neither interpreted as true nor as believable because of a lack of a theory that would make the phenomenon possible, incompatible with other established theories. And in particular, later on, it was determined that there are various alternative explanations for the data, alternative explanations that would require control of variables that were not controlled in the original experiments. These collective phenomena were known as sensory leakage. You could think of, for instance, in this example of a subject who is predicting the symbol that will appear on a card revealed from a deck. These are called Zener cards for those who are really interested in the history here. Sensory leakage consists, for instance, to take one example, of subtle cues that the researcher conducting the experiment would give to the subject's study to indicate or tip them off to what answer that they should be giving. There's a lot of complicated historical details about this, but what happened was in these sorts of cases was that once an alternative explanation that did fit with established theory was developed and then tested for, the underdetermination between the existence of psi phenomena and these alternative explanations in terms of sensory leakage was broken in favor of the sensory leakage hypothesis, because once the relevant possibilities for cueing the subject were controlled for, the phenomena disappeared. So in my own work, I've tried to emphasize this aspect of replication, that it's not about establishing or related to or a means for directly in any way establishing the credibility of research or research claims, but about addressing underdetermination phenomena in science. So broadly speaking, it's about evidence and it's about confirmation. That is to say, evidence that allows us to break low-level underdetermination problems. What I mean by low-level here are underdetermination between, for instance, the hypothesis that the phenomenon of interest really exists, and, for instance, one got a bad atypical draw of data from the population. And by collecting more data, for instance, one can gain evidence about these competing explanatory hypotheses to try to confirm one or the other. Now, addressing underdetermination doesn't directly establish the truth or believability, hence the credibility of a phenomena or a research finding. I wonder how, if at all, they are related. But rather than speculate about that, I'll turn it over to Eden. I'm interested in their perspective on this.
Thanks for that.
Thanks,
Sam,
Sam. And Eden, I'm just going to really quickly, before you start, I wanted to just let our listeners know that we're giving you this quick opportunity to respond to Sam. But then immediately after that, the floor will be open for questions. So if people have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we can build a queue. But I just wanted to alert that that's where we will go immediately after Eden has this opportunity to respond. So Eden, please.
Thank you. Thank you for that commentary, Samuel, and hopefully I'm looking forward to the conversation that that prompts. Given the focus on credibility, I'm going to start and respond there, and I agree with you. I don't think credibility is essential to the replicability concept at all, as you note, and many of my examples from the analytic approaches highlight. A lot more than replicability is required to establish credibility, including the example from James Bogan was particularly good on that with the plausibility and so forth. All I want to suggest is that in the two uses of this concept that described in this paper, replicability is one of the many practices associated with establishing credibility. And I also want to note that credibility in and of itself is an ambiguously defined concept, as you've noted, and we should interrogate that in the same way that I'm suggesting that we interrogate concepts like the replicability. And one of the challenges with this project is where you draw the line between the tools we examine and the tools we use. In the meantime, I've been taking credibility, just for clarification purposes, to refer to the expectation that scientists trust each other based on each demonstrating reasonable grounds that they have followed due process, which may sometimes, but not always, include replication practices where that is appropriate. I have responses to some of the other questions, but it'd be nice to open it up to the floor and maybe I'll circle back to some of those if that sounds.
All right, that sounds good. I just put a note in the chat to remind people that there's several different ways that you can ask a question. You can do so directly using the raise hand function. You can also place the question in the Q&A tool. And finally, you also can place a question in the chat. Any of these will work just fine. So questions, comments, discussion from those listening.
I can keep talking in the meantime if people people have to do that.
Well, maybe I will take the host prerogative and
Sure.
ask a question that is related to the methodology that you adopted in this presentation, and that is that you sort of have a little bit of an assumption that there's a continuity between the uses of the concept in the context of scientific discourse and the use of the concept in the philosophical discourse. And so to talk about using the replicability concept as a scientist or using the replicability concept as a philosopher, we're able to do some of the functions that you suggest. But I could imagine that somebody might want to keep the meta concepts used to analyze science separate from the scientific discourse itself. So maybe to put the point in a completely different context, somebody might say, yes, it's true, scientists talk about causation, but they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. And so their use of that meta concept is not what we might have in view when analyzing causation from a philosophy of science standpoint. So just one example like that, kind of from a different concept, different domain than what you were talking about, obviously. But I'm curious what you would say kind of in response to that sort of methodological concern.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What I'm curious about there, I'm not, just to make sure I'm understanding you. So in this, what I was comparing was evaluative approaches and analytic approaches to studying sciences. Evaluative approaches are often like meta-researchers, involve meta-researchers who are scientists, but I think that is a slightly different discursive context than, say, scientists who are practicing science and not thinking about that kind of meta questions about whether or not replicating something is good or not. They're doing the practice as they've kind of been trained, and as you say, in that context, they may be using a specific use of the concept replication again. And there's been sociological studies of this. I think McCulkey and my name's gone blank. A good from the 80s, right, on this about the conceptual shifts among scientists using the concept of replication. And I'm not talking about that I'm talking about the way that as meta researchers or historians or philosophers or sociologists, we start with it's the meta level of studying how scientific practices happen. And in that context, especially as philosophers, paying attention to the concepts, our analytic concepts, or the how and Samuel might have something to say on this about like how are we measuring, if you're evaluating something, what are the concepts you're using to measure what you're evaluating? And I think that's kind of what I'm focusing on when I say the use of these concepts rather than the use of them in practice, because that's a different conversation.
So maybe the place where I would then be most interested in is if you have scientists who step back and engage in reflection on, say, a concept like replicability and its application in the sciences. So let's take the evaluative dimension. Engage in that because they want to improve their own practices in some respect. They engage in a kind of meta activity, but they might actually do that differently than somebody who's a historian, a sociologist, or a philosopher, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of the point, I think.
Well, so
that they're using it with a different goal. They're not. I'm not suggesting they're using the same concept. They're using. So when we think about concepts and we break them down into those components, there's a bunch of space within that where if you're using it for a different goal, you're highlighting different inferential components so that it isn't like you're using the same concept, but you're not using it in the same way, and that matters. So you're not even necessarily referring to the same thing. So if the scientist comes in and says, oh, that's interesting, I want to think about replication, and doesn't engage with the historical, philosophical, sociological literature at all, which happens, right? They can do that. And I think they can do that productively at the same time that those who are looking at it from a more analytic perspective are doing it productively, and they're generating insights that sometimes overlap and sometimes don't. But the two approaches don't actually have to align directly, I don't think.
Okay. So yeah, I guess maybe this brings us into the space of one of Sam's questions about the descriptive versus the normative in sort of how this is operating. So maybe I'm inviting you to come back to Sam's question a little bit on the descriptive versus the normative.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I get asked this a lot, but I think it depends on the focus. So I don't have any normative suggestions for studying replication practices specifically. However, my proposal that there is value in interrogating concepts as goal-directed tools is a suggestion that that approach is one of many productive approaches for studying scientific practices. So I guess you could say it's normative in that sense of it's like, my opinion is that one productive way of studying scientific practices is to say, what are the concepts being used, say, in this experiment, and are they being justified? What is the history of those concepts? What are the underlying assumptions that we're taking for granted and allowing to influence our results without even thinking about it? And that's at the experimental level. And so what I'm suggesting is that I'm exploring the possibility of, can we do the same thing at the meta level, at that, as meta researchers or philosophers or so forth? Can we say, well, what are the concepts we're using when we're studying scientific practice? What are the assumptions that are coming along with those concepts? And I think we do that already to some extent. It's more about that kind of notion of like drawing out specific elements of insights that have come from studying experimental practice using concepts as tools and seeing if that is useful as a reflexive practice.
So maybe just one further follow-up on that. In thinking about the normative import of this meta work, is it the case that the evaluative or the analytic can suggest changes to or modifications of ongoing practices themselves? That is, if I'm a practicing scientist, can I look to meta work as a kind of strategy for doing better science?
I'm going to quote Nicole Nelson on this. She has an analogy where she said that, you know, if you're a PhD in philosophy and you get on a plane and then someone has a medical problem, you're not that kind of doctor, right? It's I would see myself as, you know, in this context, a historian, a philosopher who's studying scientific practice to, you know, understand it. I can provide a lot of context along with a bunch of other folks doing the same thing, but I can't give you a cure for a problem as a scientist. I think it's up to scientists themselves to do that. And they are doing that. They're engaging with that space, the meta research space around this. You've got the interdisciplinary stuff. I think there is definitely a role for this kind of work and philosophers engaging with scientists and collaborating with them. But I would be very hesitant to suggest a normative claim and say scientists should do X or Y. Definitely. That's not I'm definitely in the descriptive space here.
Okay, so we've got a couple hands, Sam and Dana. I'm going to go to Dana Mathisen first. So, Dana, you should be able to talk now if you unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the talk. That was, I really love the way you kind of laid things out. And I was just kind of curious, and maybe this is pulling you again too far in the normative direction. I was curious, yeah, what sort of implications you think this work might have for the way that philosophers have talked about or approached the so-called replication crisis. One tendency in that literature is to treat this as an issue that spans multiple fields, not just social psychology, but also the biomedical sciences, areas of neuroscience, so on and so forth. And I wonder if that kind of broad, multidisciplinary way of diagnosing the issue makes sense within the kind of framework that you're presenting, or I guess because I see this tendency in what you've shown towards kind of a more piecemeal, dividing things up kind of way of going about it. So yeah, does this change the way that we talk about or diagnose something like the replication crisis?
Thank you for the question. I would say that as a description, I've drawn the examples in this talk, and in the paper, there's a lot more, draw from a whole bunch of different fields. Like, it's not specific to any one field of scientific practice. And that is in both meta, so both the evaluative approach and the analytic approach are looking at replication practices across multiple scientific fields. So definitely wouldn't suggest it's only in the social sciences or anything like that, from a descriptive lens. From a normative lens, the only thing I think I would position this as in terms of contributing to the replication discussion directly is saying that when, say, people taking a different approach, say you're someone taking an evaluative approach and you've got someone else taking an analytic approach or vice versa, and you disagree about how replication should happen, what the correct approach to replication is, that there is a particular replication that is required for this particular field of study and all of that, to just take a pause and reflect on what are your goals when you're using that concept? What are you trying to achieve with repeating a study? And recognizing that people who are studying replication practices from an analytic perspective have a different goal. They're not necessarily looking at improving a specific type of practice, whereas an evaluative approach might be much more it feels really urgent, right? We need to fix replication now. Like, it's a problem. And they're very different perspectives. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think they both have value. So in terms of a normative perspective, I'll just be like, just be kind to each other. I don't know. Yeah.
Right. So Sam, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Fits very nicely with the discussion that Dana started. So, so Eden, you suggested that one kind of recommendation that you could give to folks who are studying science, either meta-scientists or philosophers or historians, is that apparent disagreements could be due to these different perspectives. Now, I wonder, though, how well that fits with your anti-normativity regarding the practices of sciences. And it has to do with the fact that many scientists who do meta-science precisely because they think that the conclusions that they draw are relevant for scientific practice. So they take up, right, a normative connection between the results of their meta-science research and what you might call their first order scientific research. So we reach a kind of dilemma here, right? On the one hand, if you were to give advice to people disagreeing, it seems that that advice would have implications for that scientist's normative practices, unless you disagreed with their assumption that there is a normative connection between their first order scientific practice and their meta-scientific practice. But that seems itself to be a scientific assumption as well. Maybe I could just invite you to say more about how I could be imagining this this conflict, and you don't see a conflict. So how do we dissolve the conflict?
I think it's good to highlight. There is definitely a tension, and there's a bit of me that's kind of wearing two hats. And to be clear, this paper was written. The rest of well, it's a paper that has scientists and philosophers and historians on it. So it's an interdisciplinary paper, and that perspective comes out in that. I'm coming from a history and philosophy of science background, and that is very clear in my descriptive approach. And I work with meta researchers who are some of whom definitely have a normative approach. And I think that is appropriate in contexts. If you're trying to improve science, you're going to have a normative approach. In terms of this paper, I guess this paper is written for a particular book that is focusing on concepts, that space that I was talking about, where I've drawn that prior research into it. So the audience for this paper is philosophers, not scientists, to be clear. So, or historians and philosophers and so forth. And it's drawing on the case study kind of the kind of meta research and that kind of debate around, like I mentioned Nicole Nelson's comment earlier, there's been a bunch of panels trying to get people together to talk about this from different perspectives. And I guess I think there is value in interdisciplinary practice, where you have some people who are focusing on a descriptive approach and some people who are focusing on a normative approach. And I think there is tension there, definitely, but I don't think that's bad. I think it's a productive tension. I think being able to kind of shift back and forth within a team, say, between the descriptive and the normative, means that both are strengthened by that practice, I think. I think if you do, for me, engaging with how scientists are actually doing practice is super important for doing descriptive philosophy of science, and vice versa. There's plenty of scientists who reach out and be like, what do you know about philosophy of science that is relevant for this? And it's difficult to answer that without being embedded in that scientific practice to some extent, or engaging with those scientists. So again, individually, I wouldn't offer a normative stance. But if I was part of a team and say we developed a tool to improve replication practices, which incidentally I was part of the Replicats project, and that, for anyone interested, is super useful research project that has a normative content. Like, we can improve how we evaluate research claims, I think, with that hat on, with that meta research hat on. But in this paper, I don't have that hat on. I've got a philosopher hat on. So definitely attention, yeah.
Okay, further questions, comments, discussion? Okay, well, I think then that can be our signal that we should wrap things up. So let me end by thanking both Eden and Sam for joining in this event. Eden for preparing a great talk, and Sam for a stimulating commentary. Thank you to all of our attendees for being here with us. Just remember that we have another International Postdoc Forum coming up next month. Check out mcps.umn.edu for more details about that. And you can always look at previous versions on our YouTube channel where the recordings are available. So thank you to everyone, and take care, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.